Good morning from my bunker in Sydney. I'd like to start this session with an acknowledgement of country, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. On behalf of RIMS Australasia, I'd like to thank you all for joining this summit, and I wish you a very good morning, good afternoon or good evening in your particular time zone. I hope you've enjoyed the first day's sessions, and I'm looking forward to another day of thought-provoking sessions. By the way, if anybody missed yesterday's 3 sessions, the recordings are available on RIMS Australia's website. Now on to the housekeeping. This summit has been approved for CPD points by both ANZIIF and NEBA, and you get 1 point per hour per session. Attendees will be emailed attendance certificates post-event for their records. I'd also like to thank AXA XL for making this session possible. We will be using Zoom, and just a few housekeeping about Zoom. All cameras and microphones are turned off, but please ensure they stay off to avoid disruption. We will be using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions. Please type your question, but also look at the other questions and upvote any other attendee questions that you'd like to see answered personally. And please be advised that these sessions will be recorded and distributed, so please be conscious of your comments or questions being asked. And on to the session. COVID has posed many challenging issues, but for some companies it has accelerated the innovation cycle as they've been forced to pivot and adapt to changing market conditions. With innovation happening at speed, I welcome Michael Masterson, Managing Director of Australia and New Zealand at the Global Intangible Asset Specialist EverEdge, to share his insights, case studies and practical advice on how companies can manage and mitigate risk in the current environment while still allowing innovation to thrive. Michael has many years of experience in working for or working with high growth businesses, helping them to evaluate innovations and opportunities, develop robust commercialization and risk management strategies. He's also a founder of a number of successful startups in various different industries, but always with a fresh angle. So I just hand you over to Michael, and welcome.
No, thanks very much, Trevor, and thanks again to the team at RIMS. We think this might be the 4th year EverEdge has been asked to present. So I don't know if that's a new record or not, but hopefully we're saying stuff that's of interest to everyone. As Trevor said, hopefully everyone's grabbed a coffee. What I'd like to do this morning is take you through, for those of you who were able to join us at the in-person RIMS conference last year, is a couple of topics that I touched on that I want to, that have certainly expanded in the last 12 months. And in particular, I want to take you through some case studies that we're going to look at, in particular, how companies have really used positive risk, and I'm going to rephrase positive risk. Those of you who attended last year will know what I'm referring to. But really, how do you ultimately use this to make money? And at the end of the day, unless you're in a not-for-profit, which really is about driving revenue, it really ultimately, the reason we go to work is to try and generate a return for our investors. So again, some of these slides, if you have attended my presentation before, I do need to go through, mainly because if you haven't been to one of our presentations, it's really about setting the scene. And then once we get through those, as you will see, there's a lot of new interesting material that we've created for this presentation this morning. So you guys are my trial, so hopefully this goes well. So quick bit of background about EverEdge. Again, for those of you who don't know us, offices around the region, we've been actually going for over 13 years now, and we've worked with a really large variety of clients. And it's literally everyone from the person who hasn't even found their garage that's coming up with their idea, all the way through to Fortune 100s. And there's 4 really key things that we're going to do, and I'll touch on each of these today, because again, what I'm wanting to do is share some of the experience that we've had with some of our clients, and particularly help you avoid some of the mistakes that they had made. And the first is really identifying what those intangible assets are. Now that sounds really obvious, but as Drucker says, you can't measure what you can't manage. And so that's why that's step number 1. Number 2, is risk is often the easiest thing to deal with. And I'm really talking about the negative risks here, the things that will impact value in a negative way. The third is, how do you put a number on this? And putting a number on it is really relevant, as you'll see, because again, it's not until you put a number on it, you then realize the value and therefore what resources you should be putting around it to protect these assets. And then the fourth is, intangible assets are nearly always worth more in big hands than small hands. So if you're not fully utilizing those intangible assets, and it might be, for example, an opportunity to license those products out. And again, I'm going to take you through some case studies around that. So some of the clients that we've worked with, I don't know if we've got any of our clients on the call today. It's everyone for people like, you know, QIC, Queensland Investment Corporation. We've just done some really interesting work with Rhino Rack. I'm sure everyone's got them on top of their roofs. And probably one of my favorite clients are Treasury Wines. So I tried to negotiate a contra deal unsuccessfully. And then into the US, some very, very large clients who we all know well. So I thought it would be worthwhile, first of all, defining the two words that we're going to be talking about today. I know it might sound obvious, but innovation is one of those words that you hear all the time, often used in a variety of contexts. So I really want to define how I'm using the word innovation. And I did borrow this slide, or recreated this slide, from someone. I saw this about 4 or 5 years ago, and it really resonated with me. And one of the things that the person said is that innovation, you know, true innovation is not where the crowd are, but it's where they're going to be. And again, I'm happy to sit on this slide for a couple of seconds, because it took me a couple of seconds to go, hang on, what are they really talking about? And, you know, innovation is not incrementalism. You know, we often, I think a lot of people confuse, you know, those incremental gains as being innovative. I remember a very senior person from one of the banks saying, wow, you know, we've come up with this really new innovative feature. Instead of swiping left, you swipe right. I'm like, that's not really innovative. And, you know, we've seen lots of examples of this. You know, I think Uber was an incredibly innovative company. They convinced us that we didn't get cabs anymore. You know, a lot of us now, including me, don't get cabs. You know, we'll stand there for 5 or 10 minutes waiting for an Uber in front of the taxis. So I found this really cool video. If you haven't seen this, if you could just indulge me for the next, it only goes for about 90 seconds. But what's really interesting is how this guy at a music festival created innovation. So hopefully this isn't too loud on your computers. As I said, it only goes for about 1.5 minutes.
You gotta like try to figure out a number and throw it into your review. How many people came up and danced with this guy?
Let's say this is the 6.
Let's call this guy 6.
So again, hopefully that woke everyone up, but I mean, I couldn't find a better example. And, you know, for anyone who's ever done a startup or been that crazy person dancing inside their organization with their new idea and trying to convince everyone else to join them, I absolutely know how that guys feel, because you do feel like the crazy one at the start. And I thought what was really interesting is that it was only within sort of a minute that he has like 40, 50 people joining him. And again, I don't know if that resonated with you, but it certainly resonated with me. So hopefully I've covered innovation, what I'm really talking about, which is that disruptive innovation, you know, doing the things that haven't been done before. The next one I want to tackle is risk. And again, for those of you who saw my presentation last year, we introduced this new idea. of dis-risk versus U-risk. And I borrowed it from distress versus U-stress. So distress is the bad version of stress. U-stress is positive stress. What enabled all of us to get out of bed this morning, grab a coffee, and then come and listen to me. Hopefully everyone's still there. So, I thought some of the best visuals that I could find for this was, this to me really is distress. It's kind of out of control. You focused on obviously everything potentially going wrong, whereas U-stress is when you're a lot more, U-risk is where you're a lot more in control about what you're doing. You're doing it to drive a certain behavior. Both of these guys started at the same point, and they're probably going to finish in very different points. So, again, just going a little bit more into dis-risk, this is the risk that everyone knows, okay? This is not what I'm going to be talking about this morning. I will touch on elements of those later in the presentation, but really the stuff that I want to focus on is the things that drive that innovation. And again, this is where, that U-risk or positive risk, whatever you'd like to call it, is really there to drive how you achieve that growth and ultimately how you achieve a better return on investment than just doing the normal business as usual. And so here's an example that I'd like to put forward. And this, again, I'm sure is probably very, very obvious to all of you, but every single company starts as an idea. I know that might, again, seem obvious, but by starting from that initial idea, you start to appreciate that what happens is that you start off, every business, Coca-Cola, GE, all start with an idea. You start off with negative revenue, which means that you're operating at negative margin. And you cannot take any higher risk than the day you start a business or the day you start maybe a new division, a new idea, etc. As that revenue grows over time, though, it starts to become de-risked. And the reason that starts to become de-risked is you can start to put people in around you that can start to take some of those responsibilities away from you and then start to look at how things go wrong. However, what also happens is that as that revenue starts to plateau, you find that if you continue to do the same things as you were doing yesterday, in other words, not taking any positive risks, you eventually find that your margins start to taper down and you decrease your market share. And unfortunately, that often results in companies not being around for very long. So when you think about, the risk side, it's really often focused around the threat or the loss. Now, what this leads to is a reduced profit, but also then follows is a reduced return on your investment. And and we've got lots of examples in history around this. Nokia, for example, had one of its most profitable the year before Apple came along and introduced the iPhone, which resulted in significant losses and eventually closures of Nokia. And Kodak was very, very similar. Whereas U-risk is typically focused on opportunities and growth, which obviously will normally lead to profit if you get it right, and then lead to an increased ROI. And what I'm talking about here too is not betting the farm. So we've seen a lot of examples of where companies have done the traditional corporate venturing. Corporate venturing, I struggle to actually find an example of where it's actually worked, where they've been able to generate a significant return on their investment. And one of the best examples I can see of a company that does this every single day, it's baked into their DNA, is Netflix. And if you haven't read the recent case study done on Netflix, it is amazing. I mean, the way that Netflix is driven all day, every day is that, if you're not focused on U-risk, they pretty much get rid of you. It's the old GE approach of rank and yank, if you're familiar with it. So what you find though, is that not only dis-risk often leads to an eventual downsizing of the company or eventual closure in the case of Nokia and Kodak, but it's also where other people will disrupt you. In other words, that's their fishing ground. That's where they find the opportunity. So for example, the banks ignored, the Afterpay type solutions. Afterpay gets up, as does Zip. And now we're seeing the banks scrambling to try and find competing products. So again, I would warn any significant organization, all those large organizations start as the idea, they grow over time, but then they do become often a little bit lazy. And they tend to become very, we've all heard that phrase, risk adverse. Well, they're risk adverse of the dis-risk, the negative risk, as opposed to embracing the positive risk. So the third element I now want to introduce, so we've covered innovation, hopefully we've covered risk reasonably well, is I now want to talk about the role that intangible assets play in all of this, and they are absolutely key to it, as will become apparent. So again, okay, why should we worry about intangibles? Well, for those of you who haven't seen this data, this is the S&P 500 over the last 40 years. So 1975, intangibles didn't really matter because they only made up about 18% of the S&P 500. So intangibles are the yellow part. And again, the focus was around tangibles, plant, equipment, and machinery. A couple of things happened in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. The first, which is really obvious, is we see the tech companies coming on stream. But what we also see, and remember this is a US example, was US firms offshoring their balance sheets to China. So in other words, they weren't just sending over the what, they also had to send over the how. In other words, the way you run that plant, equipment, and machinery, your formulations, your recipes, your trade secrets. And so what you find is that yesterday's supplier is now today's competitor. And the best example I can come up with this is Huawei. It's not like Huawei woke up one morning and went, hey, we know how to do 5G. They got taught by Nokia, Ericsson, AT&T, Bell Labs, etc. But now you see intangible assets accounting for at least 87%. Remember, this data is a little bit old now, of the S&P. And so point being is that the accounting standards were really written for an industrial age. And that's why they were incredibly relevant in 1975. As you'll soon see, they're not that relevant today. So, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about intangible assets? The way you calculate this data, by the way, is you take your market cap, less your fixed assets, your debt, and your cash. The only thing left is your intangibles. So they're often called a variety of different things. So lawyers, we often hear it called IP. The reason we don't call it IP is because everyone goes straight to thinking we're talking about patents, which we're not. We're ultimately really talking about how are you going to drive margin and/or market share ahead of anyone who's comparable to you. And this is why Buffett, he calls it an economic moat. If I go out to the manufacturing sector, they call it secret sauce, so do entrepreneurs. But then intangibles then break down into these buckets. And we often see goodwill either on the balance sheet or even intangibles when they're recorded on the balance sheet. The recording of intangibles on the balance sheet is typically an accounting treatment. It's where you take an asset, obviously write it down over time. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this stuff. All of the stuff that's not on the balance sheet, or very rarely, or definitely not on the fixed asset register, and you normally can't find it in the P&L. And these are really the core drivers of that company's performance. And in particular, we see this sitting initially in things like systems and processes, the idea, and brand starts off being worth pretty much zero, but brand is where we see the value ultimately be captured. It's like the umbrella or the scorecard for all of the other intangible assets quite often. But here's where it gets interesting. These intangible assets then break even further down again into these buckets. So for example, if I'm looking at a manufacturer, often the most valuable resource sitting in a manufacturing client that we work with is actually their bill of materials. And with every single client we've ever worked with, I've never once seen their bill of materials even identified as an asset. In fact, normally when they see this slide, it's normally where someone in the room starts tapping heavily and locking down the bill of materials. And we had a client recently where a certain foreign country were actually caught stealing the bill of materials. And the reason we know that they stole the bill of materials is because we'd put a dummy copy of the bill of materials in their cloud environment. The real bill of materials is actually held in an offline environment. Why the bill of materials? For those of you not familiar, it's often the blueprint for where you find all of the other intangible assets in the business, the supplier information, the manufacturing inputs, etc. And then what you see is that, okay, if that's a manufacturer, well, with technology companies, it's just orders of magnitude more. So hopefully we've covered off, everyone's now got a good feel for when I'm talking about intangible assets. So let's come back to what we were talking about, is how you use positive risk to drive innovation in a pandemic. And as we've seen in COVID, it's led to some very, very large winners. So this is some data that I pulled from the Financial Times where They listed public companies that had really done well in the pandemic, and they looked at what their equity value was that they added in this period. Now, what's interesting is that on the left-hand side, the ones that are labeled are the ones that added more than $1 billion to their market cap. So they've added at least $1 billion. And, not surprising, it's been predominantly the tech companies, FANG, if you're familiar with FANG, Facebook's, Amazon's, etc., that have really, really done well. And, I mentioned Netflix before that have done exceptionally well in this period. And it's not surprising that the companies that have done well are, guess what? Those that are predominantly intangible. Amazon is a slight exception. In fact, Amazon actually had a negative profit or continued their negative profits because of the investment required. And again, the industries that did well, again, were the intangible industries. So, not surprising. Okay, we could all say, well, pharma would have, of course, done well, but actually there's been a number of areas in pharma that have done exceptionally well in this period as well. So I thought I'd take an example closer to home. We're all familiar with this company, Atlassian. So what Atlassian's done this period has been really interesting. The first thing they did is they rolled out a whole bunch of new free products. And they'd actually already tried this methodology. In fact, they'd done it in the 2008 and 9 financial crisis. And this was actually their launch pad to some of the most significant expansion that they had within the business. The other thing they did that was slightly counterintuitive is they hired more staff. They added another 1,000 people. In fact, the reason they did it, a bit like what Alan Greenberg did at Bear Stearns, is that the best time to add people, he believed, was in a bear run. So as the market's going down, that's the time to add staff because they're more cost effective, they're more available. And actually when you go into a bull run, that's normally where he would pull back. And Atlassian also made an acquisition. Now, this was really interesting at the time because there was quite a bit of criticism. Why would they be out acquiring? Well, often assets are never cheaper at this point, but also what it enabled them to do was to start to build that competitive advantage, starting to build out. Remember, I talked about that, it's intangibles often are your defense mechanism. They stop other people being able to compete with you. And what it's resulted in for them is that they actually ended up increasing their revenue by 29%. And their market cap grew significantly, and they were one of the 25 most successful companies. So again, that's an example close to home. Okay, and another one that we all know, Disney. So Disney were very focused on generating ad revenue. And one of the things that they did was that they actually moved away from using ad revenue as their revenue source and started to move to subscriber revenue. They also started to bring out shows like, for example, Hamilton, if you haven't watched it. So a lot of content that normally would have gone to cinemas, they started to stream. And what was interesting is that this really accelerated their growth. Now, okay, you could say that, well, COVID, people were at home, but the thing is that Disney took advantage of this situation. They could have very easily ignored it. And what it meant is that they were always aiming by 2024 to get to 60 odd million subscribers. Well, they were able to achieve that during the pandemic. They got to about, so far, I think 55 million. Another example, media. Media, you think, wow, media is really struggling. Yeah, media had been struggling significantly. And two examples of where I think they got it right, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, is that they started to really look at how they could scale those systems, and in particular focus on free trials, that kind of freemium model, which again was going against a lot of what their peers did. And what they found is that, not surprising, their growth grew significantly for their digital, and they ended up growing their revenue by $285 million. In fact, what was even more interesting is that the Wall Street Journal ended up growing to 3 million, but 2.2 of those were digital only. So in other words, they moved from the tangible, the physical newspaper, to the intangible. Again, I know, really obvious. I'm sure obvious for everyone. So now let's get into, well, why do we focus again on tangibles? And it's, by the way, we did have this slide before RIMS. I did see RIMS utilizing the iceberg, but it's because you manage what you can often see. And so, the traditional focus is very much on the fixed assets, which is where risks typically sit. But again, if you think about where the intangible assets sit, they really do sort of sit below that waterline. And so all I would say to you is that, you know, that's why we say the first thing any client should do is start to work out what their intangible assets are. In other words, try and make them visible. And I'll give you an example of this. So this is where, for example, if this company had have used its intangible assets to not only drive innovation, it could have also avoided its bankruptcy. So this is the example of Nortel. So they went to bankruptcy in 2009. They got rid of all the tangibles for 3.2 billion. And the last asset they had was some intangible assets. Now, in this case, they had some significant intangible assets being their patents. So they were on their balance sheet for 31 million, and the market was already estimating they were worth $1 billion. Now, you already see the immediate disconnects between what the balance sheet's saying and what the market's saying. But where it gets even more interesting is they ended up selling them for $4.5 billion. Now, that's 145 times what they were worth on the balance sheet, and the patents were worth more than the entire company. So what's the moral of this story? If Nortel had have identified that their patents were a major asset and a major source of positive risk, what they would have done, and it would have been seen as risky at the time, is sold those patents and then licensed them back. So in other words, they would have freed up a whole bunch of cash and it would have helped them avoid bankruptcy. The other asset that they never saw or never really did anything with was their brand. So for example, the Nortel brand, from what I can gather, has never been reused. And can you imagine if Huawei had bought the Nortel brand? I don't think you would have seen Trump banning Nortel in North America. So the next slide I'd like to take you through is, again, okay, well, is all innovation good? Well, unfortunately not. And that's because people often focus on, is it a good idea or a bad idea? And the classic mistake we see everyone from VCs to large corporates making is they don't really get their head around the left axis, which is, does it have a weak or a strong intangible asset position? And again, this is one of those unseen risks, as everyone gets excited about the idea. And to be honest, this is sort of probably one of the #1 mistakes we see corporates making around innovation. And the reason this is an issue is because, well, if it's a failure, it doesn't really matter. No one's going to copy you. The problem comes in where if it's a success and you've got a weak intangible asset position, everyone will copy you. Now, the reason this is a problem is because it generates ultimately subsistence margins because it's a race to the bottom on price. Remember I said at the start that intangible assets ultimately drive your margin into your market share, which is how you generate ultimately your ROI. And you're going to see how this plays out. So the only place that you really ultimately want to play if you want to generate sustainable margins is you've got to be in this top right-hand corner. So in other words, is it a good idea? Yes. But more importantly, what's going to stop other people copying us? And Apple's a great example. That's why Apple has such significant market share in its category, but more importantly, they've got really good profitability. So if we just take the right-hand side, so okay, it's a success. That's great. So we know that we're difficult to copy. The reason this is important is it's a proxy for your market share. In other words, the harder you are to copy, the more market share you will generate from that. This is where we come back to the first slide that I took you through, which is why are intangibles important? It's because ultimately your intangible asset strength is a proxy for your market share, which is how you generate your revenue or margins, which is how you drive profit, which is ultimately how you generate that return on investment. So when you hear about boards in particular talking about we've got to achieve, exponential growth, what they're really talking about is how you become difficult to copy and how you can capture that. So I'm going to give you some examples of where we've seen clients use that positive risk to drive innovation. In other words, doing the stuff that probably wasn't obvious. This was a client that had come up with the amazing idea of, hey, look, we're going to launch fresh dairy. Probably not such a great idea, especially out of New Zealand. But what that inadvertently does, they'd also come up with an amazing packaging technology. Okay, so what? You might be thinking at the moment. It's a new packaging technology. Well, what we also worked with them to do was to out-license that packaging technology. Remember I said the fourth thing that you often do is identify, should we hold these intangible assets? Well, licensing is a form of taking what you can't do a lot with and putting it into the hands of very big companies. So we worked with them to do that. It's now shipped over 1 billion units, but what's most important is it increased their EBITDA by a multiplier of 15 times. So let's say you on an exit event, you were going to get 4 times EBITDA. This is like the turbocharger that goes on and you end up generating a 60 times EBITDA exit. That's essentially what it did. Here's another one of our clients. This is much bigger end of town. They couldn't grow any more in their home market. They could only expand into the US. So they were going to take the traditional approach of your classic 50-50 joint venture. What they didn't realize at the time was that they had really valuable intangible assets: brand, registered designs, data, systems, processes. And again, because they didn't see them as an asset, they hadn't considered to incorporate them. So what we did, we valued what the other party's assets were, what our clients were. We did a wash up, and what that resulted in was our client not having to put in 25 million US into the deal. They actually only ended up putting in $3 million of US, and it was actually predominantly as goodwill. So it saved them $22 million because, again, they hadn't seen these as assets. That was the negative risk. But by seeing these as assets, we were able to incorporate that and explain them to the other party. And the third one that I'll leave you with is one of my favorite clients, because this is the guy that taught me secret sauce. Because I remember meeting him about 8 years ago, and this is a traditional manufacturing business. But as I started to talk to him, they had significant market share. They were driving above average margins ahead of everyone else. And I'm like, well, you must be doing something special. And he said, well, I don't have IP. And as we got talking, he said, well, that's our secret sauce. And that's where I borrowed it from. Well, they wanted to do an exit. And again, one of the things that we'd been able to capture were what their intangibles were. And we understood that's why they were often, in fact, they very rarely lost a bid. They went through a sale process, and we in particular made a point of explaining to the bidders what those assets were. We deliberately didn't price them because, interesting enough, the way you often generate a true valuation is working out what it is to each individual party as opposed to what it's worth to you as an asset. Coming back to that point, you've got to put a number on it. As a result of that, we ended up generating $20 million more than any traditional valuation would have identified these assets as being worth. So fantastic outcome for the client. In fairness, this was pre-COVID. So let's jump into the top risks that we see. And I'm not going to cover all of these. But these are far and above the top 5. So another way to look at this is that if you think about the known risks that often chief risk officers are dealing with, and risk as an industry typically deals with, it's very much what we see as the above the waterline area. The one exception of this is cyber. So cyber is very much, from our perspective, sitting on the waterline. And this is where I'd like to dive into a little bit where cyber sits. So that first risk, which is the leakage or theft of critical confidential information, is really that cyber aspect. And that's why I've put it on the waterline, because I know that a lot of you are starting to think about cyber and, more importantly, the impact that it can have. So if we just go into risk number 1, typically it happens through the 3 obvious areas, either through your customers, in other words, sharing information that typically you shouldn't be, because they often then share it with your competitors. This can also happen through suppliers, and in particular through employees leaving. And we often find that this is not covered in exit interviews, and that's if exit interviews are done at all. So what then happens is you find that there's like a slow erosion over time of your competitive advantage, which leads to, over time, slow reduction in margin and or market share. And so bringing this back to the cyber conversation, what we typically find is that nearly all cyber focuses on one particular area, and I'll cover that in a moment. So the first area that it often deals with is what we call the external threat of the unknowns. And this is your classic hacker, phishing, emails coming through, etc. But the second part of this is the industrial espionage. And we're probably dealing with almost a client a week at the moment where they've had either a design, a new product, key data, pricing information, stolen through an industrial hack. So in other words, it's someone who wants what they've got and it's not their credit card data. The second, which often goes missed, is the knowns. And this often comes about, again, as I mentioned, through contractors, suppliers, and partners. A good example of this is a lot of companies work with outsourced IT providers, and quite often those IT providers have admin level access. And again, we often see that this is sometimes missed by the chief security officer or even the chief risk officer. So again, it's finding where is our weak point, that lowest common denominator. And the third, which might surprise you, is the internal threat. So these are the really well-known people, and this is, you know, employees and directors. We had an example recently where a director of a company, mid-sized company, was inadvertently sharing really key intangible, key confidential information with a particular party who was then inadvertently sharing it with a major competitor. So where we kind of sit, and hopefully you can see this, is that you might see around that fantastic castle is that there's a fence. And this is often where we see cybersecurity focused. And I'll give you an example of this. Cyber insurance is almost always focused on the fence. And because if someone gets through the fence, often the policy will pay for the fence to be repaired. It doesn't repair the castle walls, and it certainly doesn't put the jewels that were sitting inside the castle back inside the castle. And the easiest way to test this is look at what you pay for your cyber insurance policy. If your company is worth $100 million, your cyber policy should be $2 to $3 million at least. And again, not many people we've ever come across have a cyber policy of that value. So again, all I would say is that really the cybersecurity is around the fence. And really what you want to focus on is, again, those digital assets. So don't think, maybe even change the terminology from cyber to digital asset security. And it starts to shift your mindset away and starting to understand what are the real assets. And more importantly, they might not be worth a lot to us, but what are they worth to another party? Number two, most companies, unfortunately, a lot of companies can't even prove they own their assets. And if you think about it, a lot of this happens because quite often the documentation process in companies is not as good as it could be. Now, in fairness, corporates are pretty good at this. But what it leads to is, in particular an exit event, is that you can't prove the chain of title. In other words, prove the company actually owned its assets. The fourth biggest risk, I'll just go through briefly, is that they often don't own their brand. And unfortunately, a great example of this was Afterpay. So Afterpay, for those of you who aren't aware, is not called Afterpay in the United Kingdom. It's called ClearPay. And the reason being is that they didn't own their brand. Now they could have, but unfortunately they didn't take this risk seriously. And we know that because we tried to tell them. And unfortunately, when they went to go and file it, someone had already registered Afterpay. And part of it really comes about because a lot of people don't understand how trademarks work. There's two aspects of a trademark. There's the word mark, and then there's what's called the device mark or the logo mark. In other words, a lot of companies own the golden arches. They don't own the word McDonald's, for example. So, okay, what should you do? And the first thing, again, coming back full circle, is just work out what those intangible assets are. You know, if you want to use them to drive innovation, you've got to work out what you've got. And that leads to the second point is, well, okay, what is our strategy? We now know what we've got. How are we going to use it to drive that innovation? Because again, a lot of these, the inherent risk is that you don't know what they are. And then third is work out what both the dis risks are, which in fairness, I think a lot of you are well across, but also work out what those U risks. In other words, how could we use them to essentially self-disrupt? And then four is how do we then incorporate that back into our business strategy? And again, just to state something that we say in all of our presentations is that, you know, directors and officers have a fiduciary responsibility in the first part to protect and manage the assets on behalf of the shareholders. This is all the assets, including the intangibles. So if you don't have a list of your intangible assets, I would say, well, you're probably not managing, you know, what was probably accounting for 90% of where your value sits. And if you haven't seen this saying, I thought this is probably a good place to finish, but we all know, you know, a lot of you work for large companies and the big often do eat the small. But if you can use your intangibles to disrupt others, it's often the fast that eat the slow. And this is why, you know, we've seen, you know, I know that I was just picking on Afterpay, but, you know, they've had phenomenal growth. And that's because they saw an opportunity that the banks weren't taking, probably because the banks saw it as a dis risk rather than a U risk. And Afterpay see it as a U risk, and they then execute on that. So look, I'm happy to leave it there and take some questions if there are any. So I will, and again, you're welcome to reach out and we can send you a white paper around this, and more than happy. We give everyone a free hour to have a chat and see if we can help. And I've certainly had some very interesting conversations with the chief risk officers recently. So yeah, I'll work out how to stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Michael. That was very interesting. I suppose if I can start with a quick question, if you look at the example of Rio Tinto recently,
Yeah.
with their response to their destruction of some sacred sites. For anyone who's not aware, Rio Tinto, as a mining company, purposely destroyed some Aboriginal sites of around 40,000 years old. Their response was to fine some of their directors around about 7 million, and that elicited a huge backlash from their investors, who obviously saw that as interpretation of intangible value. Do you have any comments on that and how we should approach that?
Was a classic example, and a very, very unfortunate example. I think it was, yeah. But where Rio didn't really understand the impact that its brand can have, both positive and negative. And certainly what I would call, that community engagement was definitely a disrisk. I know that they brought in a specialist law firm to help them advise on that. And I would like to hope that if they'd seen any of the presentations we've ever done, they might have thought differently about that and thought, actually, is this really going to ultimately build our brand? And remember, that is still their biggest asset. They're built because that enables them to go out and get sites. And I would say that that's going to have a significantly negative impact now. It's gone from a massive asset to a massive liability, in terms of, I suspect a lot of people won't want to engage Rio, especially at a government level, for the negative implications of working with someone like Rio.
We've got some other questions coming in now, so I'll just open that up. So the first question is, how does one start identifying core company intangible assets?
Look, it's a great question, and it starts really with those buckets that I identified initially. Obviously, you know what your brand is because you've all got business cards, but starting to get into those systems, processes, and the way that we do it is really identifying what's driving the value in the business. In other words, what's ultimately giving you that margin and/or market share, and it's then you work backwards. You also need to start at kind of the 100,000 foot view. Don't try and do it at the 10-foot view. You will not only go insane, but you'll go broke. And the reason being is to get down to that level of granularity. Often it's completely unnecessary, but we often find clients misclassify information. And again, I didn't go into this, but there's essentially three main buckets. The first is what we would call trade secrets. And this is the stuff that if it gets out, it kills you. It's game over. And it might be key pricing information, etc. If it was Coke, it was originally their formulation. Now it's not. In fact, their formulation is no longer really a trade secret. And the reason being is that their biggest asset is their brand. The second is what we then put into is classic confidential information. And this is the stuff that wouldn't kill you, but it would really impact your margin and/or your market share. And this is maybe the next, if trade secrets maybe say 1% of all your information, this next bucket of confidential information is maybe 19%. And then the remaining 80% is it's just the stuff that enables you to do your business. It's not super critical, and it's not directly linked to margin and/or market share. So it's, again, work out what are those major asset groups. Then second of all, work out what's their importance to our margin and/or our market share. And then you start to, under each of those buckets, then drop down. And you may have seen, for example, on data, getting into things like bill of materials and, pricing information. And over time, you want to build those out. And we've built a number of models that we then put into clients where they then use that either at a organizational level or even at a department level to start to understand what those assets are. In other words, start to build an intangible asset register. The same way you've got a fixed asset register, it's doing the same thing for your intangible assets.
So just to follow on for that, so would you then look to create a risk register with controls and key risk indicators for your intangible assets as well? Yeah,
I talked about this, I think, at last year's conference. So I didn't want to cover it again this year. But I mean, quite honestly, out of the 1,000+ clients we've ever worked with, we've only ever once seen any resemblance of intangible assets on the risk register. And the risk register is that the third element. Because again, once you know what you've got, you know what the value is to the organization, then you can start to recognize them on the risk register. and start to, again, get this visible at a board level. And, you know, one of the things I would love to see happen is where the chief risk officer is not seen as, you know, Darth Vader walking into the C-suite's office. You know, it's like, oh God, what's gone wrong now? Bob either wants more money or something's blown up. But where they genuinely see the chief risk officer, not just on the negative side of risk, but the positive side of risk. In other words, hey, we've identified this potential opportunity, this positive risk, this U risk, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, now we can actually start to use it to drive additional revenue streams or generate better margin and or market share. In other words, risk has two sides of the coin. And, you know, from the work we do with boards and in particular the CEO, I can assure you risk is not seen in the positive light. It's nearly always seen in a very negative light.
Thank you. I think that's the end of the questions. So it probably just leaves me to thank you for a wonderful presentation and your insights, and also our session sponsor, AXA XL. And then finally, there's a reminder that our next session starts at 12 p.m, which is Influencing the Unseen with Lisa Tay, and sponsored by IAG. And attendees are welcome to attend sessions that they may not have registered for, and the access link is exactly the same. And if anybody's interested in becoming a member of the Australasian chapter, please go along to the RIMS Global website, www.rims.org. And finally, we would love you to complete our post-attendee survey and let us know what your thoughts on this session and other sessions are. So at that, I'd just like to say thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Trevor, and thank you again to the RIMS team for having us back for a fourth year. Hopefully we get back for a fifth year next year. So yeah, and as I said, happy to continue the conversation if you'd like to reach out. So hope everyone has a great day.
Lovely, thank you.